In most years, annual military pay raises are fairly straightforward. Everybody gets the same percentage raise. But Congress is considering something different for fiscal year 27, a larger pay raise for junior troops and a smaller one for senior service members. Why is that? And more importantly, what does it say about the financial challenges facing today's military families? Today, we're joined by military journalist, researcher, and Navy spouse, Jennifer Barnhill. We're going to break down not just what's being proposed, but how military pay is set, why targeted pay raises exist, and what this debate tells us about the future of military compensation. My name is Ryan Guina. Thank you for joining us on the Military Wallet podcast. Jennifer, thank you for joining us as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to chat today.
Awesome. Well, let's set the stage a little bit and talk about military pay raises. It's not something that just happens. There's a lot of debate and a lot of back and forth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the soup is made. In general, the law states that military pay raises are tracked by the Employment Cost Index, or the ECI, that's put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, that is more of a recommendation. Law says this, but Congress has the ability to come back and say, yes, we're going to do this plus 0.5%, which has happened a few times in recent years, or they can negotiate and make different changes based on the greater needs of the military and their own agendas. So when this happens, the House and the Senate are given kind of a recommendation by the Department of Defense budget request, which comes down from the president's office. And then we create what's called the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA. That's a lot of things going on. So from there, the House and the Senate Armed Service Committees review and draft their own versions of the law. So they may both come down and say, yes, we're going to do what the ECI says, and we're going to recommend this raise, or they may come back and do something a little bit different. From there, each of the House and the Senate vote on it, and then they get together and they do what's called the conference and final passage. And then they basically negotiate and say, yes, this is what we're going to do. And it goes to the president's office. Big process, a lot of negotiation, and a lot of things can and do change in that process. And it's not just pay raises, it's the entire National Defense Authorization Act. So it's budgeting for acquisition, recruiting, retention, fill in the blank. It's a little bit of everything. Okay, all of that sets the stage. Let's talk about the 2027 military pay raise proposal. So in 2026, we had a 3.8% pay raise across the board. That was for every service member. This year, there are two different proposals. One is a flat 3.6% pay raise that would be across the board for everybody in the military. That has been put forth by the Senate. The House, on the other hand, and the House Armed Services Committee has proposed a tiered percentage raise that more heavily targets the junior service members and then decreases as you increase in rank. So there's a 7% proposed raise for E1 to E5, 6% for E6 to O3, and then 5% for O4 and above. So what this tells us is that they are trying to target junior enlisted members a little bit more because probably they feel those members need it. So all of this to say, a lot going on. Jennifer, why don't we talk a little bit about this, and then we can talk about, is this normal? Is this something we've seen before? And what can we expect during this process?
So you said a lot of things, and I think a lot of the people, the actors that you're talking about, seem to be, people, elected officials, doing all of this work. It's the room where it happens, right? But there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that involves family members. It involves advocates, organizations that work on behalf of our service members and our families. And they're also in those rooms advocating for those individuals based on what they're hearing from the community. So although the listener might not think that they're involved in this process, there's someone representing service members always in these conversations, not just those, calculations from a three-letter agency or, things like that. It's a lot of interpersonal conversations that happen too. So I think that there's some hope there. It's not just someone far off in the distance making decisions that impact service members' lives.
I'm glad that you brought that up because, a lot of times we just think, hey, we see these raises happen, right? Okay, the cost of living is this, and military retirees and people who are receiving Social Security or VA disability, they will see the annual cost of living increase. That is pegged by law to this percentage. It's a calculation, and you can calculate, several months out, and people try to predict what that raise is going to be. And then by law, it's going to be that raise. Military, though, on the other hand, they have to take a lot of other factors into account. You can't just peg it to an index, for example, because in the military, you have to look at what I like to call them the three R's, right? So it is the readiness, it's the recruiting, and the retention. So if members aren't enticed or they're not able to meet their bills or they can get a better paying job on the outside, they're going to do that. So the Congress and military leadership need to look at this and they need to say, how can we keep these people happy? How can we keep them fed and in houses and all of that? We talked a little bit offline before you came on, and you talked about a quadrennial review about how the military looks at pay and benefits and things like that. Can you talk just briefly about what that is, what it looks like, and how that's designed to help military families get the pay that they need to be compensated fairly for what they do?
Yes. So the quadrennial review happens every 4 years. The last one was put out in January 2025. So, of course, different each administration kind of gets a turn to do, the cycles in and out of their review. The most recent one was kind of unique and a little surprising in the sense that it really focused on the need for dual incomes as a military household, and needing to consider not just the service member compensation, but the household as a whole. So when you have family members, when you have children, there's different calculations that are need to be considered. And for many, many years, it was kind of assumed that by having this number, the compensation being slightly higher than a comparable civilian position, that it would be enough. But more and more, we're finding that we need that dual income to get by, especially in those high cost of living areas. And historically, military spouse employment has been a struggle. Not everyone's able to retain high paying or good paying jobs when they move every 2 to 3 years. So the quadrennial review this past year, or last year, looked at what does that mean? What is military spouse employment? How does that factor into retention? How does that factor into recruitment? And they made their advised based on that information, which is a brand new concept that hadn't been introduced in these previous reviews for compensation. So I think we're moving in the right direction in having many of these conversations where we're looking at the family, we're looking at the individuals and the circumstances that they're facing when the DoD or the department advises what it thinks compensation should look like.
Well, I love that, and I think that's probably well overdue, right? That's something That's we can go really deeply into that topic, but I mean, we'll focus on military pay in general, but I think it's overdue to look at the impact of military spouse employment and really how the cost of living in certain areas impacts service members' ability to afford to live there. Let's talk a little bit about this proposal. So we're looking at two proposals. One is your standard, straight across the board, same for everybody, and then the other one has a targeted pay raise, which targets more heavily the junior enlisted troops. So this actually is not new. There has been a history of targeted pay raises in the military. I know when I was enlisted in the early 2000s, I think 2000, 2001, there were 2 pay raises, and that was across the board for all military members. And I remember at the time I was very junior enlisted. I was probably an E3 going to E4, and I think one of those years I ended up with 3 pay raises, and the next year I got 3 pay raises because you hit the time and service pay raise at like your 2-year mark, 3-year, 4-year mark, and then you hit a promotion, so you get that pay raise. So they weren't big raises, but when you're seeing, 3 or 4 pay raises in a year, that makes a huge difference, even if they're, 20, 40, $50 each, because those compound over time. So that was early 2000s. In mid 2000s, 2004 and 2007, lawmakers did 2 mid-year raises that were targeted to non-commissioned officers or NCOs and senior NCOs, and a lot of those were based on retention because the military had done some studies and they understood that a lot of service members were able to leave the military and earn comparable or more on the outside without having as many quality of life issues as they might have in the military, where you have to deal with PCSs, deployments, those kinds of things. Again, 2004 through 2007 timeframe, there was a lot of deployments going on, a much heavier cycle than perhaps we are seeing now. And then there were kind of the period in between then and the early 2020s was mostly just across the board annual pay raises based on the employment index that we discussed earlier, the employment cost index. A couple of those were the employment cost index plus a half a percentage point or something like that. Things got interesting in fiscal year 25 last year, where there was a 4.5% pay raise for everybody, but junior enlisted E1 to E4 got an additional 10% targeted pay raise for a total of 14.5%. So there is a history of this. And when we see these things happening, this tells us what military leadership and what congressional leaders see as important. And when they start looking at service members, when they're having recruiting issues, when you're having retention issues, when you're having members who just can't get by, you're having a lot of problems where whole different topic that, but leadership is noticing. So these targeted pay raises serve a purpose. So why don't we talk a little bit about that? Why do these targeted pay raises matter, and why are our junior enlisted members getting a huge targeted pay raise just a year and a half ago, 2 years ago in 25, and looking at another potential increase now? Why don't we dive into that? And what are you seeing in the community?
Yeah. So I think it's important to just reiterate the fact that these decisions do end up benefiting service members and families, but the decision making, that's behind the scenes is also looking at those retention numbers and the recruitment numbers. So it if you're in a position that doesn't have the high need for retention, if you're not in a role where they need to retain a lot of people in similar positions to yours, you might not see some targeted things, like looking back at your historical, the examples you gave, Ryan. So they were targeted to those jobs. So you might not, if folks decide to target pay raises, see that benefit you. So this time around, we're seeing enlisted service members having a higher bump. There's a reason for that, though, because they're the ones who are reporting these quality of life issues at higher rates, obviously, than more senior enlisted or our officers. So we are seeing things like food insecurity pop up, and it's becoming very common over the years. Folks have decided that this is not something that's a budgeting issue always. Sometimes it's the unforeseen. They're not able to build their savings over time in the same way because they have a spouse who maybe doesn't have a job because they move every 2 to 3 years. They have kids. It's hard to afford childcare, and all of these things compound. And so when you're hit with an unexpected expense, it can really put you in a bad situation. So enlisted families are reporting high credit card debt. Well, all families are reporting credit card debt. There's things like that that are occurring. And in order to equip our service members to get out of debt, to be more financially sound, they need that bump to bring them up to baseline, essentially. And that's why this is a targeted raise, I think, because we're hearing from families that it's just really hard, especially those, I think of folks in California, in the DC metro area. It's a very expensive place to be. And you don't get to choose where you go. And so, you might have budgeted for the middle of nowhere, but then you get hit with a big city expense, of living near high cost of living areas. And what do? You kind of have to just keep on going and making it work. And these targeted raises are aimed at allowing those individuals to have a little bit more of a cushion.
There's a lot going on, right? So you mentioned you might have targeted to, budgeted to live in a certain place, and then you get sent to a high cost of living area. Even if you budget for that high cost of living area, and there's BAH is supposed to help cover housing, and you start looking at things like, well, there's COLA in certain cost of living adjustments in certain high cost of living areas in the United States. You usually get it overseas as well in many locations. But a lot of these indices are lagging. So in the last few years, we have seen rents rise. We've seen interest rates increase significantly if you're going to buy a home. I understand BAH isn't designed to buy a house, but when you start looking at interest rates increasing, you just mentioned people are holding credit card debt. You look at the cost, inflation across the board, but specifically for the three big expenses, or four for many people, And that's going to be your housing with higher rents, your food with grocery inflation, your transportation, and that could be the fuel, the maintenance, insurance for your car. Homeowners insurance or renters insurance has increased significantly. And kind of that fourth leg would be childcare, as you mentioned earlier. Many people don't have access to childcare or at least to affordable childcare. So all of these compound, and the indices that the military or the government use, they lag, right? So they look and say, well, what has the cost of living done? What have rents done? Well, we will review that and we'll do a cost of living increase, but it always feels like it's a step or two behind what's actually happening. So there's a lot going on. You mentioned things like food insecurity, for example. I know there are some programs out there that can help military members. Do you have a little bit of insight? So for anybody who's listening, whether it's they're listening themselves or it's one of their troops that they want to point toward some resources, what is out there that can help service members and their families? Maybe if it's food insecurity, or maybe they're just having a hard time with income shortfalls or making ends meet.
Yeah, so there are a few, and many of them are, targeted towards those with families because that, one we see that, a service member might get by if they're single, right? But then once they add, they get married, they have a kid or two, it becomes harder to cover those costs with this similar amount of pay and a lot more expenses. Those jump, and so I think there's this assumption that service members enlisted service members are able to qualify for things like SNAP, which assists those in need to pay for groceries. They can buy, the staples with those SNAP benefits. However, SNAP benefits, the calculation includes BAH. So we know that our service members, especially our junior enlisted service members, often live on post on the installation. And that's not money that they see. It's not money that they can bank. So although it is a wonderful benefit and it counts towards their overall compensation package, it doesn't assist them when looking at things like SNAP calculations. The other programs that are available are WIC, which helps provide, nutrition for breastfeeding mothers, postpartum mothers, and it's for those who have babies, and so that's really helpful and not really hard to how many. I don't even want to think about how much I spent on diapers. It's an expensive time having a newborn, and this really is a wonderful program. But over the years, there's just been little hurdles that make it harder for people to access. One of the hurdles was like how SNAP benefits are calculated, and eligibility is calculated. The other is overseas WIC. They used to, in the States, they have kind of a credit card where they get a credit. They can use that credit card similar to SNAP at the grocery store. Overseas was different, and only until 2025 did they change the policy. They had coupons that they would have to use and redeem them in the commissary, and it was just a very cumbersome process. So there's always been these little things that, because the military isn't always top of mind, like who thinks about that, but it became a burden and hard for people to access this program benefits because our families were stationed overseas. So over the years, awareness, folks have been working to raise awareness of these programs, the availability of these programs, and I think that awareness has helped first reduce stigma, but also encourage and make people aware of the needs of families and that they are in need of this assistance because compensation doesn't always cover for those costs. And having those benefits allows them to bank some money for that unexpected expense. So these are wonderful benefits, but they're not always easy for folks to access.
Yeah, thank you for outlining that. I know a lot of these programs exist, but it seems, as you mentioned, that many military members do fall through the cracks. So it's one of those things where if you feel that you are struggling or you feel that you might qualify for some of these benefits, seek out some assistance on your post installation base, whatever your branch is going to call it, right? There are always going to be either a financial counselor on base or somebody who can help you run through the benefits that are available to you, help you apply, or if you're not eligible, they might be able to point you towards some other resources. So thank you for highlighting some of those issues and topics, but also some of those benefits and resources that might help some service members. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of this targeted pay raise, right? So typically everybody, like I said, they get that same raise across the board. If in fact there is some kind of targeted pay raise toward junior enlisted members, I love it. By the way, I'm kind of mid-career, mid-ranking where I am now, and I 100% would give up a larger raise to ensure that our junior enlisted members are getting what they need, because they are the backbone of the military and they are the future, right? So we need to ensure, we as the military and as leadership need to ensure that our service members are taken care of, and that we are able, that they are ready, that they are, we want to retain them, and we want to recruit new service members. So a little bit of that, I kind of mentioned those three R's: the readiness, recruiting, retention. The other is just quality of life, right? Is just making sure that people can live a decent standard of life, that they can take care of their families. Is there anything else you see with a targeted pay raise that we haven't touched on to this point?
Well, I think that, you know, having this resource will really help make it attractive to serve, because I think that because we have so much access to social media, and although service members may not be on there, complaining about pay and benefits, not to say that spouses are out there complaining about pay and benefits, but if they're just talking to friends, they're sharing their experience, the word gets out. And so when we see things like mold in housing, or we see, people going to get the food pantry and utilizing those resources that are very public facing, it does have an impact on how attractive service is. And so I think that when it comes to the targeted pay raise, I think we often don't talk about what the downside is to that, because of course, like, we want our service members to be able to afford to pay their bills. We want service to be attractive, because it's a great community to be a part of. But the downsides, I don't know if we've talked about those as much, and what the kind of pushback is. And I think often we hear stories, and this is across the board, this is not just about pay, but I will hear things, well, when I was a kid, when I was a young service member, I had the same issues, I didn't have that pay bump that you had, and I did great, and I did fine. But I would just, kind of say that that mentality is one that kind of holds us back from growing and becoming more modernized in the military. We experience different things like COVID, we experience recessions, we experience all kinds of things that are different than the generation before. And so I think that having that reminder that, yes, I'm so uh, people go through really hard things. People behind, you and others will say, oh, they have it so easy, but the reality is it's just a different version of hard.
No, 100%. I agree with you. My military career is a little unstandard, non-standard. So I enlisted back in 99. So I saw some of these pay raises I talked about in the early 2000s. And then I had a huge break in service. I was out for 8.5 years. When I came back in, I joined the Guard. So I'm reaching almost my 20-year point. So I've seen a little bit of varying things, right? I'm also just where you are in life. So you see this a lot when you deal with financial topics or things like that. Well, it's, just work harder, or just go get a second job, or X, Y, Z. But you're right. Times are different. A lot of service members today are coming in, and, they grew up in times of, the Great Recession. They dealt with, COVID and things like that. College costs are not getting any cheaper. Debt service is a lot more expensive now. So you're right. Housing is significantly more expensive. When I was, I'm going to date myself here, but I graduated high school over 25 years ago. You could still get a minimum wage job and live in a decent apartment in most places, and you just can't do that in many places anymore. It's very challenging, and I feel that a lot of things have not kept up, and things are a little more challenging for some people now. So, fairness, you touched on that. I think, yeah, some people might say, well, yeah, I was able to do it. You should too. But you're right. Things are very different. One of the other potential criticisms that people could look at with these targeted pay raises is something that's called pay compression. And that's when your pay bands start getting too close to each other. I don't think this would impact most ranks or most pay grades, but One example might be the difference between an E5 and E6, for example. In most branches is a big difference. You become that subject matter expert. You're expected to do a lot more. And if the targeted pay raise hits up through E5 and then doesn't as much hit the E6 and above, you start getting compression in those pay bands. And then what is that incentive for somebody who doesn't necessarily plan to be a career service member? What is their incentive to really try to get that E6 if they say, it's only an extra $150 a month, but I have to take on XYZ additional duties or my job requirements are going to increase. So those are things that I think some leadership might want to keep an eye on down the road. Other than that, I don't see too many criticisms, complaints, or really many downsides to it. But what else we can look at is, we've touched on a lot of topics, not just pay, but we talked about benefits. Jennifer, from your perspective, I know you're tapped into the military spouse community. You do a lot of research. You're a journalist. You've written a book on the topic, so you are really dialed into this segment of the population and what's going on in the military community. What do you see as some of the bigger issues beyond just base pay that military leadership in Congress can look at and address going forward to help our military community?
Great question. So pay is an approach to the problem, right? It addresses, it hopes to address many symptoms, multiple symptoms at the same time. This must be coupled with financial education, right? You get more pay. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to not get into debt because you didn't have that lesson when you were younger. That can always still happen, right? Like, although those trainings are always available to service members and families, it doesn't mean they're going to take them. So other multi-pronged solutions are really required. And so it's addressing the specific symptoms directly. So that could look like improving barracks, improving privatized housing. So, I recently read a survey by a military family advisory network. They put out a survey that talked about the housing burden. So even folks, they're not all on base. They're living all over. And the housing burden, it said 84% had a housing burden, that their housing costs exceeded what their allotment. And so families, need to have accessible housing. One of those, an example of an article that I wrote a while back, was a hurricane came through and really in one of the Carolinas, and it really damaged base housing. It also damaged civilian housing in the area. So there was like a run on housing. So people had to move farther away from the installation. They couldn't get access to base housing, so they had to live out in town, and that wasn't always financially in their plan. And so there's things that happen that are unforeseen, but years later, they're still working on getting that housing back up. And so what does it look like to be able to react to those types of circumstances, which are happening more and more with fires in California? We get, I feel like there's tornadoes on the East Coast now and hurricanes. So, there's always circumstances that the military can't foresee, but there needs to be a plan to be able to take care of those circumstances. That's housing. When it comes to childcare is an investment that benefits both the service member for their readiness as well as the family, because then you're bolstering the dual income possibilities with a military spouse being able to work too. We think of if the tornado or the hurricane or whatever took out the housing, COVID took out the childcare. There were, I think, somewhere like 60 something percent of childcare centers across America closed during COVID. And this was already an area of struggle for service members. There's only limited spaces. If you are a military spouse who's working, you're not very high up on the priority list. So building infrastructure that invests in and understands childcare needs is important. And it's something that is being worked on. But again, childcare has high costs. Not everyone has a child, so it's not necessarily always the top of mind in working towards that. But I know you spoke with Kayla Corbett, who is an amazing advocate for childcare, and she probably go listen to that episode to learn more about the childcare solutions. But there's always a way to address the problem at the source while also addressing the pay, which helps equip the service member to handle their unique circumstances. So both have to happen at the same time.
Yeah, those are all great points. And, everything that you mentioned is, like you said, pay is a part of the solution, not the only solution. And I think a lot of these other topics, they get overlooked. And again, we mentioned earlier, a lot of these things are reactionary. When you talk about BAH, so the members in the Carolinas who were displaced and had to go find housing either further away or pay a lot more for it, BAH isn't going to capture that cost of increase potentially for a couple of years. And unfortunately, those members have to eat that out of pocket. And that just hurts their budget. And if you don't have a lot to begin with, you don't have a lot of spare room, you're going to be struggling. So I think a lot of this is not being as reactionary, right? So if military leadership in Congress can see some of these problems and find ways to build solutions before they become breaking points, we're going to have a more resilient military. And I think that's where a lot of the advocacy comes in. And at the very beginning of the podcast, you mentioned there are a lot of advocacy groups who are reaching out to their congressional representatives. There are a lot of lobbying agencies who are doing the same thing. So, yes, we are not in a vacuum. It's not just the service members who are being represented. It is the military family members, it's the spouse, it's the children. But it takes a lot to convince Congress to open the purse strings because every dollar that goes toward these programs comes away from a weapons system or has to be reallocated from somewhere else. So, none of these are easy problems, right? But they are real problems and they do impact our community. And that's why we have this podcast. We want our community to be aware of this. We want our leadership to hear these words and understand that, your junior service members, especially, not just junior, but especially the junior service members, many of them are struggling and many of them do need access to different programs, especially if we want to bring in more service members, if we want to recruit them, if we want to keep them. But you're also seeing that across the board. It's not any rank, it's not any branch of service. It's people with families, it's without. It's all over. So, Jennifer, thank you so much for your expertise and for sharing all of this. I love this topic because it's just highlighting what is happening for the community. There is a lot, and there's still work to be done, but we have a lot of great people who are working on it. Jennifer, where can people learn more about you and your book? And yeah.
I wasn't expecting that question. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. The book is available on Barnes and Noble, Amazon. It's the military stories you've been told and the ones you need to hear. And it really just looks at kind of similar to what we're talking about today, looking at the idea that there's this topic, right? We're talking about pay, but behind pay, behind the topic you hear in the news, there's a lot of stories behind that. Families impacted, lives impacted. And the book kind of looks at some of those examples of the lives that are impacted. You talked about weapon systems. If the American people don't feel like their service members are being taken care of, they will stand up and say something. And so this is us in our community doing it before it gets to that point because we believe in this community and we want to help this community thrive and the people in it to be well and taken care of. So they can connect with me again, LinkedIn. That's probably the best way. I'm a nerd. I'm not great at social media other than that, but
I'm not on social either. I don't do it. But no, thanks so much for sharing your expertise. We did a podcast earlier with Jennifer as well. If you want to learn more about her book as well, you could tune into that podcast. We go in a little deeper and talk about what motivated it and some of the stories behind it. So excellent book. Highly recommend it. Jennifer, thank you for joining us. For all of you who are listening, thank you for joining us as well. And as always, thank you for your service.